I've worked with prisoners in an applied way and also in more indirect ways. In an applied way, my first ever job was assistant governor at Wormwood Scrubs in London. So I worked very directly as a prison governor for some 14 years. But now I'm probably best known for the work that I do with penal organisations, which are NGOs or charities which campaign for penal reform. We have in this country at the moment more life sentence prisoners than the whole of Western Europe combined, which gives you some sense of the scale that we're dealing with. We currently have more women, more elderly people, more young people, more people from ethnic minorities locked up than we've ever locked up before. So the difference is really just one of scale rather than the issues that have to be dealt with once we're talking about what happens inside our prison. It was the murder of James Bulger in Liverpool by two 10-year-old boys in the early 1990s. And from that murder, there was a re-consensus, a re-moralisation, a consensus between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and a re-moralisation about what we should do with people who offend. And because of that political consensus, there has basically been no difference between the left and the right in their approach to prisons. And so that consensus has allowed a very much a populist, a penal populist philosophy to develop, whereby if one wants to say anything about prisoners in the media, what's said politically is that, you know, we must never do anything that might be interpreted as being soft on crime, to the extent that we've got David Cameron at the moment saying he feels physically sick if prisoners were offered the vote. So all of that kind of moral approach, that punitive populist approach, comes from the murder of James Bulger. I believe that we should give some prisoners, most prisoners, the vote. I don't believe we should give prisoners who are never going to be released back into our community the vote. What would be the point of allowing them to vote for circumstances that they're never going to have to deal with again? So that's a very tiny minority of prisoners. I wouldn't give them the vote, but the blanket ban approach seems to me to be wrong. And it doesn't just seem to me to be wrong, it's wrong according to the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, if we believe in the rule of law, then we should not be doing anything which puts us in a position whereby we are transgressing what we're being told to do. For me, the issue is one in which, actually, if you go into most prisoners wouldn't vote. That's what I find really, really interesting. And in fact, increasingly, the public doesn't vote. Isn't it ironic that we're talking about, you know, that we mustn't give them the vote because this is our democratic right, and yet when we had our democratic right to elect police and crime commissioners, less than 20% of people turned out to vote for them. We continue to invest money in a failing social institution that does nothing whatsoever to counteract the underlying causes for why the vast majority of prisoners are offending in the first place. It does nothing to deal with the fact that often prisoners have a reading age of less than 7. It does nothing to deal with their underlying addictions. It does nothing to deal with their homelessness. It does nothing to deal with their underlying mental health problems. We've always known that, but it seems that we have a love affair with incarceration in this country, a love affair which isn't shared by our European neighbours, and yet we don't seem to be able to break this political consensus that wants to bang up more and more and more people, whilst just across the channel, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Belgians, the Swedes, the Norwegians are no more criminogenic than the English, and yet we choose to bang up more of our people than our European neighbours. I like the idea of finding ways of reconnecting prisoners who have usually been school excluded to the community. So I'm all for schemes which are about social inclusion as opposed to social exclusion. Mentoring schemes for people who are serving less than 12 months, however, I think are only really putting a plaster over the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is, why do we feel we need to send ever-increasing numbers of people to jail for under 12 months? There are a whole range, a plethora of community programs that probably would be much better to ask that offender to engage with, rather than continuing to bang them up and then giving them a mentor when they're released from that experience.